The Second World War was an unimaginable struggle for millions of people. Yet in many, it unlocked heroism within themselves they didn't know existed. Today, we know the names of many such heroes, but countless others remain anonymous. It's important to know that many women also contributed to victory. Their stories deserve to be heard and shared. Andrée Piel, the owner of a beauty salon in the French town of Brest, never imagined that she would become an active member of the resistance. However, when she witnessed retreating French soldiers in 1940, she could not remain indifferent. Andrée decided to help the soldiers by hiding them at her salon. She asked neighbors for donations of men's clothes and gave them to the soldiers so they could dress like civilians and evade capture by the Germans. Then, together with other local residents, Andrée started distributing an underground newspaper that published General Charles de Gaulle's famous address about the resistance. Andrée devoted herself to the fight for France's liberty. She became an agent for the French resistance and helped pass along intelligence about the German fleet's actions in the military port of Brest. But even that wasn't enough for her. Andrée organized a team whose job was to search for shot-down British and American pilots, clothe them in civilian garments, and give them safe shelter where they could wait for extraction. Sometimes Andrée and her team of volunteers had to hide the foreign pilots for weeks, as the submarine that extracted them would only come to French shores once a month. The Gestapo eventually found out about Andrée's activity, but she managed to flee to Paris and continued to participate in the resistance from there. However, on May 10, 1944, Andrée was arrested and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. While in the camp, she miraculously managed to avoid execution several times. On April 11, 1945, the prisoners of Buchenwald stormed the guard tower and took over the concentration camp. Just a few hours later, American troops entered to complete their liberation. Andrée Piel never thought she would take part in war, but when obligation came calling, she rose to the occasion. Andrée saved more than 100 people and inspired thousands more to fight against the Nazis. A German student and former member of the League of German Girls, Sophie Magdalena Scholl, had become disillusioned by Nazism several years before the war. In 1937, Sophie and her siblings, Hans, Werner, and Inga, were arrested by the Gestapo on suspicion of being part of an anti-Nazi group. Their family home was searched, and diaries, magazines, and collections of poems were confiscated. Sophie was released the same day since she was only 16 years old. Inga and Werner were released a week later, and Hans spent another 3 weeks in prison. The arrest left Sophie shaken and only deepened her dissatisfaction with the Nazi government. She became even more determined to oppose Hitler's regime. When Sophie enrolled at Munich University, she immediately found like-minded students there. They decided to organize a nonviolent effort. Calling themselves the White Rose, the students started printing leaflets to expose Nazi crimes and call for resistance. After the group's 5th leaflet came out, the Gestapo began actively looking for White Rose members and promised a reward of 1,000 Reichsmarks for help in capturing the student activists. Despite their efforts, the Gestapo never managed to stop White Rose activity. In January 1943, student protests began in Munich University. White Rose members took part, printing and distributing new leaflets. When Sophie dropped a pack of leaflets from the 3rd floor onto the inner courtyard of the university, one of the employees noticed and reported her to the Gestapo. Sophie was arrested. The Gestapo demanded that she show remorse for her activity against Nazism and turn in her fellow group members. She refused. As a result, Sophie Scholl was executed. But even in death, her beliefs and resilience inspired other Germans to continue fighting against Hitler's regime. Before the war, Irena Sendler was just an ordinary social worker from Warsaw. When German occupiers set up the Jewish ghetto in the capital Poland, Irena's best friend Eva ended up behind a 3-meter-high wall. Irena couldn't just stand by and watch. Not many Poles could get into the ghetto, and no Jews could leave. Horrendous living conditions led to the spread of disease and famine inside the ghetto. Irena and Eva decided to help those who needed it most, the children. The best way to help them, the women decided, was to get them out. At first, Irena secretly moved orphans out of the ghetto. Then, she started offering parents the chance to have their children moved out as well. As anyone can imagine, the thought of separation was an agonizing decision, But many parents agreed because they couldn't provide protection for themselves, let alone their children. In the ghetto, any family member could be taken away to a labor camp at any moment. Before she was arrested by the Gestapo, Irena and her associates had succeeded in moving 2,500 children out of the ghetto. During her interrogation, she didn't give up the name of a single person from the resistance. Irena was then sentenced to death. However, friends of hers bribed a German officer, and she was released from prison before she could be executed. Irena Sendler not only saved thousands of children, but also gave hope to their parents, something that was so badly needed during those terrifying times. Possibly the most well-known woman of World War II was not really one woman at all. We're talking, of course, about Rosie the Riveter, whose image became a symbol of women's fortitude and essential contributions to the war effort. When the United States entered the war, many men were sent to the front and away from their regular jobs. However, factories still needed someone to work the machines and produce vehicles and ammunition for the army. That's when the American government called upon women to leave their households and go to work in factories. These calls to action were printed in newspapers and magazines, and popular songs were written. Propaganda posters encouraging women to contribute to the war effort through manufacturing were circulated widely. American painters of the day were inspired by photographs of vibrant and determined women working in the factories to bring victory closer. Proud and confident, and dressed in overalls and headscarves, these women became a symbol of patriotism and new femininity. From this moment in history emerged a folk hero, Rosie the Riveter. Her image became larger than life. Immortalized by the painter Norman Rockwell, Rosie inspired more than 6 million women to perform feats of labor to bring about the end of the war. These women were able to share in the victory of the Allied forces on September 2, 1945. Thanks to the hard work of millions of men and women who gave their strength and often their lives to the war effort, victory was achieved.